Well, happy Easter. Great seeing the late crowd this morning, and great to have all of you here today. Getting here at 11:30, you had time for brunch, didn't you? Yeah, had that Easter brunch. Well, it's great having you here this morning. And for those of you that are guests here today that are celebrating Easter with us, my name's Jonathan Dunn. I'm one of the pastors here, and we want to welcome you along with everyone else that's here that are your friends or family, your frenemies. Doesn't matter. It's Easter Sunday. We set all that aside, can't we? But it's so good because today I have something that I feel like God has placed on my heart to share with all of you. It's a truth about Easter that I believe will encourage every one of you. I don't know how many Easters you've celebrated, but possibly today you may leave, and it's my prayer you will leave, having even a deeper joy and just excitement about what this day tells us and what we're remembering today. So I'll share this with you by starting in the year 2020, sorry. I've said this now 3 times, so you think I know how to say 2020. But all the way back in 2020, just 4 short years ago, there was something that happened that involved an Easter egg. Now, I'm not talking about the types of Easter eggs that you as parents may have filled with candy and gave to your kids this morning and got them on a sugar rush, and then you dropped them off, and our poor volunteers are now in there trapped with them, okay? I'm not talking about that. Or the ones you may hide today in the yard for your kids, and you'll mow over the ones they can't find. That's not what I'm talking about. What I'm speaking of regarding Easter eggs are these objects that as we hear about or we see in movies, as well as in other types of environments, where screenwriters and others will write them in, and they're right there under your nose the entire time, but it's as if they're hidden in plain sight. So the story goes like this. Back in 2020, there was this young guy who bought his first car. He went to the gas station one day, and he was getting ready to put gas in his car, and as he put the nozzle down to his gas tank, he saw a spider, and it was a big spider, and he jumped back yelling, thinking that thing was going to attack him and I guess take his life, okay? That's at least the way he tells the story. Now, after he collected himself, he ended up inching closer to investigate this spider, maybe to see what kind of spider it was, and I have a picture of what he saw. It was not really a spider, okay? It was not a real spider. And he figured this out because of the little word bubble there, and I don't know if you can read that, but it says, "Chow baby," okay? So when he sees this spider and he figures out that this was not a true threat for his life, he laughed at himself over how he thought he was about to meet Jesus prematurely, but then also the fact that he had put gas in his car multiple times and had never even noticed this thing. So what he did after he collected himself is he pulled out his phone, he began to shoot a TikTok video, as the kids do these days. They want to record everything. And he began telling everyone about his story, he reenacted it, all these things, and then he showed everyone a picture of what he found, this spider, and then he asked all the people that drive Jeeps, the vehicles that Jeep makes, if any of them have ever noticed these things, like spiders or whatever. Well, what he didn't realize is that this video would go viral. The reason why is because all these people that had been driving Jeeps for decades in some cases, and months and years, they'd never heard of this before, so they went out and began investigating their vehicles. Now, by the way, if you have a Jeep, just chill out, okay? You can do this after church. I know some of you are curious if you didn't know about this. But they went out and started investigating their Jeeps, and then they started posting these pictures of their Easter eggs. And they posted geckos under the windshield wipers, and T-Rex skulls, and flip-flops, and sharks, and all kinds of things. And they were all blown away that here they were for all these months, years, days, driving these vehicles with these Easter eggs, these cool little features of their car that were hidden in plain sight. What they didn't know is back in 1997, Jeep began putting these little Easter eggs, these little fun things on their cars, and what they wanted was to make them obvious, but not too obvious, so that one day they would stumble upon them and they would be taken aback like this guy was, not necessarily scared to death as he was with the spider, but taken aback and saying, well, this is crazy, this is really cool. You know, when you think about Easter eggs and how screenwriters write them into movies, as well as they're built into cars, and who knows what else. There's probably a lot of things that have Easter eggs we're not aware of. And we think about the goal of those that put them in there. Their desire is to put them under our nose for us to discover them one day. And either by stumbling upon them or by someone else pointing them out to us. And then when we stumble upon them, we think to ourselves, wow, it's really cool, and I can't believe I didn't see it. And then for us to, somehow it adds value to our life. What's interesting about Jesus is as you follow him around through the Gospels, as they tell us about his life, what you see is through his teachings and through the miracles that he performed, he was in many ways placing these little Easter eggs of truth underneath the nose, if you will, of his disciples and the crowds all the time. There was these truths that he was communicating about himself, about his future, but also about the future of those who believed in him, that when people would listen to him or watch him perform miracles, they would leave those experiences not really seeing what he had done or what he had said. And so there were these truths that they didn't really notice. And this morning, what I want to do is, out of all the Easter eggs of truth that we can look at, I want to walk you through one that Jesus shared through a miracle that he performed on 2 occasions. And this was a huge miracle. And Jesus performed this miracle on the front end of his ministry and on the very back end of his ministry, right before his Passion Week. And it was when he raised someone from the dead. The one that I want to talk to you about is the one where he raised someone from the dead on the front end of his ministry. And the way that Luke describes this event is early on in his ministry, Jesus was out and about engaging with people. And while he was there with some of his disciples, this man by the name of Jairus approaches Jesus. And when he approaches Jesus, he collapses at his feet, and he's overwhelmed by this fear and this concern over his little 12-year-old girl who is back at home barely clinging to life. And so as Jesus looks down at him and he asks him, what's wrong? He begins to tell Jesus and plead with Jesus, I need you as the healer to come with me to my home now, because if you get there in time, you can heal her and keep her from dying. Well, Jesus had compassion on this father, and he said, okay, I will go with you. And so they got up, and as they started walking towards Jairus' home, Jesus got caught up in a crowd, and more than that, he got caught up with this one lady who was desperate for healing for herself. And so as Jesus is engaging with this lady, Jairus looks back toward his home, and he sees a friend of his walking his way, and he could tell by the look on his face, this isn't good. And when his friend approached him, this is what he said to Jairus, as Luke tells us in Luke 8:49. He said, your daughter is dead. Don't bother the teacher anymore. Now, can you imagine being Jairus in that moment? He goes to Jesus. He asks Jesus to go with him. They're on their way, and then this lady stops him. And as these precious seconds begin to slip away, I'm sure Jairus is growing anxious. But I mean, what do? You can't tell Jesus what to do, right? Because you need him to go heal your daughter. So he's just standing there. And then here's this lady that's holding him up that's clearly not barely holding on to life. And then his daughter dies. And so once he receives this news, his friend says, just let the teacher go. It's too late. So Jairus goes over to Jesus and he tells Jesus what happened. And this is what happened, or how Jesus responded. When Jesus heard it, he answered him, don't be afraid. Only believe and she will be saved. Jesus leaned in and looked at Jairus and said, Jairus, I'm sure as he was sobbing, it's going to be okay. I'm with you, and I'm going to take care of your little girl. So they began walking to Jairus' home, and when they arrived, this is what Jesus did. After he came to the house, he let no one enter with him except Peter, John, James, and the child's father and mother. And everyone was crying and mourning for her. But he said, stop crying, because she is not dead, but asleep. They laughed at him because they knew she was dead. So as they arrived at the home, Jesus tells everyone that's in the home, all these people that gathered to mourn over this little 12-year-old girl who had so much life ahead of her, and they're mourning her death. He tells everybody to get out of the house except for 3 of his buddies and then the parents. And then he looks at them and he says, now quit wasting your tears over this little girl. She's not dead. She's asleep. And they laughed at Jesus because they knew that she was dead. They thought he was nuts. After the house clears, this is what Jesus did next. So he took her by the hand and called out, child, get up. Her spirit returned and she got up at once. And then he gave orders that she be given something to eat. Her parents were astounded, but he instructed them to tell no one what had happened. So after the house is cleared, Jesus walks over, takes this little girl very gently by the hand, and just says, it's time to get up. When he said that, her spirit that had departed her body at death comes back into her body. Her eyes open up. She sits up. She stands up. And then everyone's blown away. And Jesus says, oh, by the way, give that little girl some milk and Cheerios, okay, right? Because she's been through the ringer today. She needs her strength. And so her parents in this moment are overwhelmed like anyone would be. And their tears of grief transform or turn to tears of joy. And then in that moment, Jesus looks at her parents and he says, now listen, this miracle has to stay here. My 3 disciples, you 2, myself, it stays here. Which meant that when that little girl, after she had her meal, decided to go outside to play kickball, frisbee, softball, whatever, with all of her friends, and those that were outside that were grieving see her, that her parents were going to have to play dumb. They're going to let these people come to the conclusion, oh, I guess Jesus was right. She wasn't dead, she was just asleep, and he woke her up. Now, in this miracle where Jesus raised this little girl, there is a truth, a huge truth, that he communicated through his words, but also through the miracle itself, that was hidden, if you will, in plain sight. It was a truth about himself. It was a truth also about those that believed in him and about their future. But in the moment, these people couldn't see it. They didn't know. All they knew, especially the disciples, was, that was cool. I've never seen him raise anyone from the dead yet. Let's see what else this guy can do. But no one really knew what he was getting at, and they wouldn't know until they were on the other side of the greatest miracle he ever performed, which is the miracle that we're here to celebrate today. You see, from that day that he raised that little girl to Palm Sunday, where he entered into Jerusalem triumphantly, with all these messianic cries and songs and people cheering for him, a lot transpired in his ministry. Jesus performed a lot of miracles. He healed a lot of people. He also freed people from the demonic and showing that he had power over the Satan and what he was doing in people's lives. He also would do things like walk on water. Imagine that. Calm a storm with his words. And he even on one occasion, which this is kind of fun, is he took a Lunchable and he fed thousands of people. Imagine that. That'd been a cool one, wouldn't it? But then the miracle that Jesus performed that had everyone, if you will, in a tizzy was the miracle he performed right before his Passion Week. And it was when he went to see his friend Lazarus. And he raised him from the dead. But this one was a very different situation than when he raised this little girl that was 12. This time, when he raised Lazarus from the dead, it wasn't within an hour or two of his death, like with the little girl. It was after 4 days he had been buried in the tomb. This time, Jesus didn't try to keep it a secret. This time, what he did is he raised him publicly in front of a crowd of people that had gathered to mourn with Mary and Martha and to comfort them. And this time, Jesus even declared to Martha that he is the resurrection and the life, which was him claiming that he had power over death to tell death who to let go of. And so on that Palm Sunday, as Jesus entered into Jerusalem, the followers of Jesus were convinced that he was their Messiah, he was going to be their king, he was going to sit on the throne of David, he was going to do all of these things they'd always believed and trusted God for. The only hurdle that was left was for Jesus to deal with Rome, to get them off of their backs, and that he would be their king. And truthfully, they believed Jesus couldn't be stopped. Because how do you stop a man that can tell death to let go of people and raise them back? Right? I mean, how can you stop someone like that? Now, today, we all know the story. We can read it. On that Friday, the mother of Jesus and a few of the disciples are there at the cross, and they're looking up at the one that had exercised so much power in so many different ways. And as they were watching him, they saw that death was squeezing the life out of him on that Roman cross. To their shock and to their horror, they're watching this thinking, what is going on right now? They're grieving. And then when Jesus took his final breath, it took their breath away. When he died, their hope died with him. And guys, they were terrified, absolutely terrified. Many of them hid. They tried to stay out of the light because they were afraid that they would be next. Well, Joseph of Arimathea and Nicodemus went, requested the body, very hastily buried his body because of the Sabbath that was right there. And then that night, on that Friday night, I'm sure, and on that Saturday, they likely were just grieved and heartbroken and confused over how did this happen. But then these ladies on Saturday started preparing to go back on Sunday morning to take these spices and clean up the mess these guys had left where they didn't take care of Jesus' body the way it should have been. Ladies, we know that y'all have to clean up behind us a lot, okay? So this is just in the scriptures, you see this. So these ladies began to prepare these spices, and then on Sunday morning, Luke describes for us what happened on that first Easter. And this is what he records. On the first day of the week, very early in the morning, they came to the tomb bringing the spices they had prepared, and they found the stone rolled away from the tomb. They went in, but did not find the body of the Lord Jesus. While they were perplexed about this, suddenly 2 men stood by them in dazzling clothes. So the women were terrified and bowed down to the ground. "Why are you looking for the living among the dead?" asked the men. "He is not here, but he is risen. Remember how he spoke to you when he was still in Galilee, saying, 'It is necessary that the Son of Man be betrayed into the hands of sinful men, be crucified, and rise on the third day?'" And they remembered his words. These ladies that morning, when they took these spices and they were walking to the tomb, they never would have imagined they would get there, that the stone would be rolled away, they would have walked in, and that the body of Jesus would have been missing. They never expected that. And so as they're standing there in the middle of this empty tomb and these 2 angels appear, which they didn't expect that either, by the way, they fell to the ground and they were terrified. And then what had to be shocking to them was that the angels then asked them a question. "Why are you looking for the living among the dead? Why are you looking for someone who's alive where dead people hang out?" And then the angels began to remind them of something. "Remember throughout his ministry, these 3.5 years you were with him, the times where he spoke about how it was necessary for him to be betrayed, and then for him to be crucified, and then for him to rise from the dead? Remember that?" And Luke notes, and they remembered his words. As these ladies were standing there in the empty tomb, it was through the empty tomb that they were able to look back on those 3.5 years and all these truths that Jesus had shared about himself that didn't stick in their minds and their hearts in the moment. They all began to make sense. Because when Jesus said these things about being betrayed and crucified and then rising again, that didn't make sense to them because clearly God was using Jesus in a powerful way. He was healing people. He was feeding people. He was doing all these amazing things. He was talking about love. All these amazing things were coming from his life. And so how in the world would God ever allow someone like him to be crucified like a criminal on a cross? It just didn't make sense. But as they stood in that empty tomb and they looked back, they thought, "Oh, now we see it. Now we see these truths, and what we see is that it was necessary for Jesus to die on that cross for our sin, so that our sins can be atoned for, so that we can be made right with God, and that we can become sons and daughters of God." And then they also saw that it was necessary for him to be killed, to be buried, but for him to walk into death and walk out the other side of death. Because as the one that was the resurrection and the life, not only did he need to raise other people back to life and say to death, "Let go of them," but he also needed to lay his life down and also tell death to let go of him and him walk out as well. And that's exactly what Jesus did. And what happened in this moment and in the moments that followed for these ladies, for the disciples, is they saw the empty tomb, but even more than that, when they saw the resurrected Jesus, and they ate with him. That'd be kind of cool, wouldn't it? And then he would speak to them. Is what they began to see is that Jesus is back. And they transformed from being people that were afraid and that were hiding to people that were fearless and filled with hope. And it was all because they began to look at everything through the resurrection of Jesus. Not too long ago, I was scanning the internet, and I found an article where a journalist interviewed one of my childhood heroes. And this is one of my childhood heroes. I'll put a picture of him up for you. Arnold Schwarzenegger. Anybody else? Anybody else love Arnold Schwarzenegger back in the day? Even now, maybe? Yeah. I loved him back then because, he had huge muscles. The dude was, and he still is. He's a big guy. But also, I loved his movies. And so I would sneak around my parents and watch some of the movies they told me not to watch, with Arnold in them. I loved Arnold. But what really caught my attention about this interview that Arnold had with this journalist was this journalist sat down with him and began to ask him for his perspective on what happens at death and all this stuff about heaven and the afterlife and all that. And when he asked Arnold, what happens at death? This is what he said. Nothing. Nothing. You're 6 feet under. Anyone that tells you something else is a blank liar. Now, fellas, I know how your brains work. You want to know what that blank is. But just just chill till after church, okay? Don't Google this right now. It's not darn or dang or any of that, okay? I can tell you that much. That's why I put a blank there. But what you can take from his statement is he is very convinced, absolutely convinced, that when you die, that's it. It's game over. You live your life, you hit death, boom, over. You're in the ground. And he's convinced of it. They went on to discuss a couple of other things, and then he made a statement about heaven. And I thought this was very interesting. He said, when people talk about, I will see them again in heaven, it sounds so good, but the reality is that we won't see each other again and after we're gone. That's the sad part. I know people feel comfortable with death, but I don't. Wow. So when you take a step back and you look at this, along with some other statements he made, what you find is that, one, at least for me, I'm grateful he's honest about what he thinks. He's not just giving talk, and speaking and saying things he doesn't believe. But on the other side, I feel sad for him. Because it's obvious to me that for Arnold, he is a very empty person. He carries around sadness, grief, and he's very hopeless as he thinks about death. That for him, as he's getting closer and closer to the end of his life, which, by the way, he's in his, I think, late 70s now. I know he still has big muscles, but by the way, his key muscle, his heart, he's had 3 open heart surgeries and just had a pacemaker, okay? So he is increasingly aware that his life is coming to an end. But as he is getting closer and closer to the end of his life, which he is not looking forward to because he believes game over, you're in the dirt, he's watching friends and family members of his and loved ones die, and as they die, he's saying, that's it. It's all over. This whole heaven thing is just, it's a fairy tale. Now, I don't have connections with Arnold. So if any of you do, please see me after the service. I would love to connect, okay? Because I would love to ask him a question. I would love to just say, hey, I read this interview. And if you had a wish that you could offer up and it were to come true, what would that wish be? And I bet what he would say is, I wish that death would be put to death. I wish that death was not a thing. And the reason why is because what he knows in his heart, I believe innately, which is something we all know in our hearts, is that death is an intruder that robs us of life. It robs us of moments with our loved ones and our friends and others. And so this is why he is sad about this. And so what he, I believe, would wish for is that death would be eliminated and that we would live on forever. And I was just using my imagination, and I thought to myself, I could tell him a few things that I think maybe would be helpful, although he may have heard them before, but how cool would it be if we could get a time machine and take those ladies that went to the tomb and found it empty, and some of the disciples, and we were to bring them into the present, and they were to sit down with Mr. Arnold Schwarzenegger, and they were to listen to him on his views, and then they were to say to him, so listen, man, you're speaking like you're an expert on this, but by the way, you've never tasted death, so you need to kind of stop that. But what we can tell you is the one who we followed, who is the expert, he is the resurrection and the life. He died. We saw him. 3 days later, the tomb was empty. And then we saw him and spent time with him. And what we know is this. The reason why you're sad, the reason why you're grieved, the reason why you're hopeless is because you are looking at death without Jesus. You're looking at death not through the resurrection of Christ, not through the empty tomb, but you have set him aside, you don't believe in him, and that's why you are in the place that you are. But if you will place your focus and your trust in him, then you too would receive this hope in your life. And you would no longer look at death the same way. What I love is that in the first century, much like in our day today, as people were losing loved ones, they grieved. They would grieve like we do today, where you grieve of what could be with these that you were robbed of these moments with or life with, and what should be and what would be if they were able to stay. And as these people were grieving, the Apostle Paul wrote what I believe is the most comforting and powerful section in one of his letters about looking at death through the empty tomb and the resurrection of Jesus and the impact it makes on your life. And I want to show you what Paul said about this. He wrote this in 1 Thessalonians chapter 4, In verse 13, he begins with this: "We do not want you to be uninformed, brothers and sisters, concerning those who are asleep, so that you will not grieve like the rest who have no hope." Just as there is misinformation today about what happens at death, there was misinformation back then as well. And what Paul knew is that when you look at death without Jesus, you grieve without hope, like Arnold. But when you look at death through Jesus, the risen Jesus, it transforms your grief from that without hope to hopeful. And then he goes on to write, what brings us hope? Verse 14, he writes, "For if we believe that Jesus died and rose again, in the same way, through Jesus, God will bring with him those who have fallen asleep. For we say this to you by a word from the Lord. We who are still alive at the Lord's coming will certainly not precede those who have fallen asleep. For the Lord himself will descend from heaven with a shout, with the archangel's voice, and with the trumpet of God. And the dead in Christ will rise first. Then we who are still alive, who are left, will be caught up together with them in the clouds to meet the Lord in the air. And so we will always be with the Lord. Therefore, encourage one another with these words." What Paul wanted for them to know then, and what is also true for all of us today, is this reality that if you look at death through this belief in Jesus, of believing he died for you and you put your faith in him, as well as believing that he rose from the grave, that what you'll see is that as you look at death through the empty tomb of Jesus, that it helps you see what will be true for you one day. What Paul describes here is that just as the tomb of Jesus is empty, one day all of our graves, those of us that love Jesus and believe in Jesus, our graves, our tombs, if you will be empty as well. There's a word that Paul used here that maybe some of you caught it. Now, I was reading a little fast because I've done this twice already, so I'm trying to get through it for you and for lunch. But it's a word that may have stuck out to you. But if you didn't catch it, it's this word asleep. Did y'all catch that? Here's what's interesting about that. This is the very same word that Jesus used when he referred to that little girl, and the people laughed at him and thought he was crazy. It's the very same word that he used when he spoke about his friend Lazarus to his disciples, and they said, "You're nuts for wanting to put your life at risk when he's just taking a nap and you want to go wake him up." And the reason for that is because at that time, before the resurrection of Jesus, they all saw death, not just like Arnold, but a little differently, but they still saw death as like, no, they're dead and that it's over. But after the resurrection of Jesus, those that loved Jesus and believed in Jesus, they began to see death as sleep. What they began to see is what Paul describes here, that as this little girl, when she died, her spirit left her body. Jesus said her body was asleep. That for those that believe in Jesus, when we die, those that we love that believe in Jesus, when they die, their bodies sleep, their spirit goes to the heavens, they are with Jesus, and one day Jesus is going to return with them, and when he returns, he's going to cry out, and there will be a trumpet that will blast, and he'll say to all those that believed in him that it is time to rise up, as he said to the little girl, or come out, as he said to Lazarus. And when that happens, that will be when the spirits and their bodies will come back together and they will be resurrected. But here's the amazing thing.